In the harsh winter of 1883, high in the Colorado Rockies near what miners called Silver Creek Camp, a German immigrant named Heinrich Bauer became the laughingstock of the entire settlement. The camp sat at nearly 10,000 feet, where the air cut like a blade and winter cold could drop so low that axes shattered against frozen timber. Heinrich had spent the better part of autumn building what the other miners called the strangest dwelling anyone had seen, a rounded structure of stone and sod that rose from the mountainside like some ancient burial mound. Men would ride past his claim just to point and shake their heads. Tom Crawford, whose cabin sat about half a mile down the creek, told anyone who'd listen that the German had finally lost his mind to altitude sickness. By the time the first serious snows arrived, the entire camp had placed bets on how long it would take before Heinrich abandoned his fool's project and built a proper cabin like everyone else. What none of them could have known as they mocked him through that autumn was that the coming winter would bring cold so savage it would crack the very foundations of their confidence, and that Heinrich's strange dome would be the only thing standing between survival and freezing death when the temperature plunged to 67 degrees below zero. Heinrich Bauer had arrived in Colorado Territory 3 years earlier, in 1880, after working stone quarries in Bavaria, since he was barely tall enough to swing a hammer. He wasn't a miner by training, but he knew rock the way other men knew timber, understood how it held heat and shed water, how certain stones fit together in ways that made structures stronger than the sum of their parts. He'd come west after his wife died of fever, leaving behind everything familiar to start fresh in a land where a man could stake a claim and make something of himself. His plot sat on the eastern slope of the mountain, exposed to winds that roared down from the peaks with nothing to slow them. Around him, scattered across the mountainside wherever color showed in the rock, were perhaps 24 other claims. The nearest neighbor, a prospector named Jack Morrison, was close enough that you could hear his axe on calm mornings. Farther down the valley, where Silver Creek widened before dropping into the canyon, sat the main camp with its assay office, supply store, and the rough cabins where men without claims bunked together through the winter. Every man in that camp knew the brutal reality of Rocky Mountain winters at altitude. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a physical presence that pressed against you, that found every gap in your walls and stole the warmth from your body while you slept. Men would wake to find their water buckets frozen solid, their breath forming ice on the inside of cabin walls. Frost so thick on the windows you couldn't see daylight. A typical log cabin, chinked with mud and moss, required a fire burning day and night just to keep the interior above freezing. Men burned through cords of wood each winter, spent half their time just keeping themselves alive instead of working their claims. Tom Crawford's place was typical, pine logs notched and stacked, gaps filled with whatever material was handy, a stone fireplace at one end that drew like a chimney but couldn't heat the far corners. On the coldest nights, Tom would wake every few hours to feed the fire, and still his hands would be numb by morning. Jack Morrison had built his cabin into a hillside for some protection, but even banked against the earth, the cold found its way through. Men accepted this as the price of mountain life, the cost of chasing silver in a place where nature didn't particularly want you to survive. Heinrich had watched all this his first winter, had seen how the conventional cabins fought a losing battle against the cold, how men exhausted themselves and their wood supplies just maintaining basic warmth. But what caught his attention wasn't the cabins themselves. It was something he noticed on a bitter January morning when he'd taken shelter in a snow cave while checking his trap lines. Inside that hollowed drift, protected from the wind with just his body heat, the temperature felt almost comfortable. The snow itself seemed to hold warmth in a way that wood walls never did. He'd seen similar principles in the root cellars back in Bavaria, how earth bermed against walls kept the interior temperature stable, cool in summer, but never freezing in winter. He began to understand that the enemy wasn't just cold itself, but the constant theft of heat through the walls and roof, the way wind pulled warmth away as fast as a fire could create it. When he tried explaining this to Jack Morrison over coffee one evening, telling him that maybe the solution wasn't bigger fires but better walls, Jack had looked at him like he'd suggested building a cabin out of clouds. The idea that you could build something that needed less fire, not more, seemed to contradict everything these mountain men understood about survival. So Heinrich made his decision in early summer of 1883, when the high country finally thawed enough to work stone. He would build a shelter based not on timber, which every other miner relied on, but on the materials that held and protected heat by their very nature, stone and earth. The shape came to him from observation, not learning. He'd noticed how snowdrifts formed into domes, how water dropped into rounded shapes, how the root cellars back home were often arched because that shape held its own weight and distributed it evenly. A dome needed no internal supports, meant no cold corners where heat couldn't reach, and would shed wind like a river stone sheds water. The proportions he chose were practical, based on what felt right for a man his size. The base would be wide enough that he could stand in the center, with arms outstretched and not touch the walls, tall enough at the peak that he could stand upright without stooping. He calculated nothing formally, just marked it out with a rope tied to a center stake, walking the circle until it felt like enough room for a man to live and work through a winter. The other miners thought he'd gone mad. When word spread that Heinrich was hauling stone instead of cutting timber, men started riding up to watch. They'd see him working alone, prizing rocks from an outcrop about a quarter-mile from his site, testing each one by striking it to hear the sound, selecting pieces that fit together like puzzle blocks. Tom Crawford stopped by one afternoon and asked outright what in God's name Heinrich thought he was building. When Heinrich tried to explain about holding heat and shedding wind, about how the earth itself would protect the walls, Tom just shook his head and said a man needed a proper cabin with a good fireplace, not some stone igloo like an Eskimo. The skepticism only grew as Heinrich began laying the foundation. He dug down perhaps 3 feet below where frost would penetrate and laid the first ring of his largest stones. The wall rose slowly, each stone selected for how it fit with its neighbors, gaps filled with smaller rocks and the clay-heavy soil he excavated from the floor. The work was brutal on the hands, even for someone who'd quarried stone his whole life. Every rock had to be positioned just right, tested for stability, adjusted or replaced if it didn't sit solid. By late July, the walls stood about waist-high, and the shape was becoming clear. The structure formed a perfect circle, perhaps 15 feet across at the base, with walls nearly 3 feet thick at the foundation. Heinrich had learned from watching stone buildings in Bavaria that thickness mattered, that mass absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, that a thin wall was just a barrier while a thick wall was a reservoir. As the walls rose higher, he began laying them at a slight inward angle, starting the dome that would eventually close overhead. This was the part that really made the other miners laugh. Samuel Brooks, who had a claim on the ridge above, would bring visitors just to show them the crazy German building, his stone beehive. They'd watch Heinrich working alone, fitting stones into the gradually curving wall, and they'd place bets on when the whole thing would collapse under its own weight. Samuel insisted no rounded roof could possibly support itself without massive timber framing, that Heinrich would end up buried under his own foolishness when winter snows loaded that impossible dome. Through August and into September, Heinrich worked almost every daylight hour. He'd mine his claim in the early mornings when the light was good for seeing color in the rock, then spend the rest of the day hauling and placing stones. The dome grew slowly, curving inward with each new ring, each level set slightly inside the one below it. The technique was ancient, something builders had understood for thousands of years, but Heinrich wasn't working from knowledge of architecture. He was working from instinct and observation. He could see that each ring of stones, properly placed, helped support the next ring above it, that the curve itself was the strength. Where gaps appeared too large for stone alone, he packed them with sod cut from the meadow below his claim, layer upon layer of root-bound earth that would settle and seal as it dried. The sod wasn't just filler. Heinrich understood it as insulation, a layer of organic material that would trap air and hold warmth the way a wool coat traps body heat against the skin. By October, with the first serious cold already settling into the high country, Heinrich was working on the final rings of the dome. This was the most precarious part, where the walls curved so sharply inward that each stone had to be carefully wedged into place, supported by all the weight below it. He built a temporary scaffold of pine logs inside the structure, something to stand on as he worked higher. The men who bothered to check on his progress were now taking bets not on whether he'd abandoned the project, but on whether he'd survive the winter in it. Jack Morrison, who'd always been friendlier than most, stopped by on a cold October morning and found Heinrich fitting the final capstan, a flat piece of granite about the size of a wagon wheel that would cover the opening at the dome's peak. Jack watched as Heinrich, standing on his scaffold, carefully lowered the stone into place where it settled perfectly into the ring supporting it, locked by its own weight and the inward pressure of all the stones around it. Even Jack, watching it work, couldn't quite believe it held. Heinrich climbed down, kicked away the scaffold supports, and the dome stood on its own, exactly as he'd envisioned. Jack admitted it was impressive in its way, but he still thought Heinrich would freeze trying to heat all that stone mass with whatever small fire he could manage inside. What Heinrich had created was deceptively simple in appearance, but sophisticated in function. The dome stood perhaps 12 feet tall at the center, the walls so thick that the interior space was considerably smaller than the outer dimensions suggested. He'd left an opening on the south side, just large enough for a man to enter if he ducked his head, which he'd later frame with timber and fit with a heavy door. Near the top of the dome, he'd built in a smoke hole, a carefully shaped opening that would draw smoke up and out, while the natural curve of the ceiling prevented downdrafts from pushing it back inside. The floor he'd dug down to bedrock in places, leveled with gravel and clay, and covered with flat stones that would absorb and radiate heat from any fire. The whole structure sat partially bermed into the hillside, earth banked against the northern wall for additional protection against the prevailing winds. From a distance it looked almost like a natural formation, a stone outcrop with a mysterious dark opening, barely recognizable as human habitation. The first real test came in late October, when an early storm dropped 2 feet of snow and brought temperatures down to where breath froze in the air. Heinrich had moved his few belongings inside, set up a small sheet iron stove he'd bought from the supply store, and settled in to see how his design performed. That first night, with wind howling outside hard enough to shake a normal cabin, Heinrich sat inside with just a modest fire burning, using perhaps a quarter of the wood he'd normally need. The stone walls, massive and thick, had absorbed the day's heat from his fire, and now as night deepened, they released it slowly, steadily, keeping the interior comfortable with minimal fuel. The dome shape meant the heat rose and circulated naturally, no cold corners, no draft stealing warmth. The temperature inside stayed warm enough that Heinrich could work at his small table in his shirt, while outside the cold would have frozen exposed skin in minutes. He ventured out the next morning to find Tom Crawford's cabin streaming smoke from a chimney fire that had burned all night. Tom exhausted from tending it, complaining that he'd still woken to ice in his water bucket. Heinrich tried to explain what he'd discovered, how the design worked, but the explanation sounded too simple to be believed. The thickness of the walls meant they absorbed heat like a massive stone oven, he told Tom, releasing it slowly over hours. The dome shape kept the warmth concentrated and circulating, while the earth bermed against the sides, provided an extra layer that stayed a constant temperature, regardless of the air outside. The small opening meant less heat escaped, and what smoke needed to escape found its way naturally up and out through the vent at the peak. It was like wearing a heavy coat, he explained, where the warmth isn't in the coat itself, but in the layer of trapped air between the coat and your body. The stone and earth trapped a layer of stable temperature around the living space, protected it from the violent swings of the outside air. Tom listened politely, but Heinrich could see the skepticism. It seemed impossible that something so simple, something that required no advanced engineering, could outperform the proven methods everyone else relied on. Tom figured Heinrich had just gotten lucky with a mild spell, that the real test would come when winter truly arrived. The other miners maintained their doubts through November and into early December. Yes, Heinrich's odd dome seemed to work well enough, they admitted, but the man was barely heating it compared to the fires they needed, so of course he was using less wood. They couldn't see that this was precisely the point, that efficiency wasn't about burning more fuel, but needing less. Samuel Brooks insisted that when the real cold came, when temperatures dropped to where iron became brittle and breath formed ice on beards, Heinrich would discover that his stone pile couldn't possibly keep a man alive. The general consensus around the camp was that Heinrich had built an interesting curiosity, maybe even clever in its way, but not something any sensible miner would trust his life to. They had their proven methods, their log cabins and roaring fires, the techniques that had kept mountain men alive for decades. Heinrich's strange experiment was just that, an experiment, and winter would teach him the folly of thinking he knew better than everyone else. Then December brought signs that the old-timers recognized with growing unease. The clouds that settled over the peaks didn't lift for days, hanging heavy and still. The few remaining birds disappeared completely. Even the ravens that normally scavenged around the camps. The air itself felt different, pressing down with a weight that made the barometer fall like a stone. Men who'd spent 20 winters in the high country looked at the sky and shook their heads, saying it reminded them of the terrible freeze of 71 or the deadly winter of 79, when miners had been found frozen solid in their cabins. Heinrich watched these developments with the calm of someone who'd prepared as best he could. He'd stocked his small space with food supplies, had cords of wood stacked against the outer wall, though he knew he'd need far less than the other miners, had made sure his water source wouldn't freeze. Around the camp everyone else was doing the same, but with an undercurrent of worry that came from knowing their shelters had never been truly tested against the worst this mountain could deliver. The cold arrived on a clear, still night in mid-December, dropping out of the north like an avalanche. By morning the temperature had fallen to where stepping outside felt like walking into a wall of knives. The cold didn't just chill, it attacked, stealing warmth so fast that exposed skin went numb in seconds. Inside Tom Crawford's cabin, even with a fire roaring so hot it threatened to crack the stones of the hearth, the far corners stayed cold enough that frost formed on the walls. Tom and his partner burned through a week's worth of wood in 3 days, taking turns feeding the flames, trying to keep ahead of the cold that pressed through every gap in the walls. Down at Jack Morrison's place, built against the hillside, Jack discovered that earth banking only helped so much. The cold found its way through the logs regardless, and his chimney drew so hard it pulled cold air in through cracks he didn't even know existed. Men stayed close to their fires, rationing their movements, trying to conserve both warmth and energy. This was survival, pure and simple, the mountain showing them who was really in charge. Inside Heinrich's dome, the experience was entirely different. He kept his stove burning at a moderate level, nothing like the roaring infernos the other miners required, and the temperature stayed comfortable throughout the space. The massive stone walls had been absorbing heat for weeks now, and that thermal mass worked in his favor. The stones released their accumulated warmth slowly, steadily, moderating the interior temperature, even as the outside world became lethal. The dome's shape meant the warm air circulated naturally, and the thick walls meant the cold outside couldn't rob that heat faster than the modest fire could replace it. Heinrich could move around his space in regular clothing, could work at his table, could sleep through the night without waking to tend the fire. He used perhaps 1/5 of the wood that Tom Crawford was burning through, maybe less. The temperature inside never dropped to where he could see his breath, never approached the brutal cold that filled every conventional cabin. He was warm, genuinely warm, in conditions that were killing men in their supposedly proper shelters. The cold persisted for nearly 2 weeks, temperatures staying so low that the remaining moisture in the air formed crystals that floated in the sunlight like tiny diamonds. Men ventured out only when absolutely necessary, moving between cabins to check on neighbors, sharing wood when supplies ran low. On the 8th day of the freeze, Tom Crawford's chimney finally gave up, a stone cracking from the thermal stress, smoke backing into the cabin until he and his partner had to choose between freezing or suffocating. They wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned and made the half-mile walk to Heinrich's dome, desperate for shelter. When Heinrich opened the heavy door and they stumbled inside, the contrast was so immediate and profound that Tom actually stopped in his tracks. The air inside was warm, genuinely warm, warm enough that Heinrich stood in his regular work shirt, warm enough that Tom could feel the heat on his face like standing near a summer campfire. The small stove in the corner burned with a modest flame, nothing like the inferno Tom had been trying to maintain. He looked around the circular space, at the curved stone walls that seemed to radiate a gentle warmth. At Heinrich, sitting calmly at his table like winter outside was just a minor inconvenience, and something inside Tom Crawford broke. The validation wasn't triumphant or loud. Tom simply sat on the stone floor, still shivering from his ordeal, and said quietly that he'd been wrong. He'd mocked Heinrich for building what seemed like madness, had bet against him, had refused to believe that anything so different from convention could possibly work. But here, feeling the difference in his bones, watching Heinrich comfortable in conditions that were destroying everyone else, Tom had to admit the truth. Heinrich had understood something fundamental that the rest of them had missed. The German had built not just a shelter, but a solution, had applied observation and logic to create something that worked with nature instead of fighting against it. Heinrich said little in response, just offered Tom and his partner space near the stove and shared his coffee. There was no gloating, no lecture about who'd been right or wrong. The structure itself was vindication enough. The warmth and safety it provided while others suffered said everything that needed saying. Word spread quickly through the camp, the way news travels among people facing shared danger. Within 3 days of the chimney failure, half a dozen miners had stopped by Heinrich's dome, ostensibly to check on Tom Crawford, but really to see for themselves if the stories were true. They'd step through the low doorway, duck their heads under the curved entrance, and emerge into the surprisingly spacious interior, and every single one had the same reaction. The warmth hit them immediately, a heat that felt alive and constant, maintained by what seemed like an impossibly small fire. They'd look at the thick stone walls, touch them, and feel the accumulated heat radiating from the mass. Understand in a visceral way what Heinrich had tried to explain with words. Some stayed quiet, processing the revelation. Others asked questions, wanting to understand the principles, how the dome shape worked, why the thickness mattered, how much less wood Heinrich was actually using. He walked them through his reasoning, explaining in his careful English about thermal mass and heat retention, about how the dome shed wind, and how the earth berm protected the northern exposure, about how the whole design worked together as a system, rather than just a pile of rocks shaped into a shelter. The temperature finally broke in early January, climbing back to merely brutal instead of lethal. When men emerged from their cabins to assess the damage, they found a landscape of consequences. Tom Crawford's cabin needed complete chimney reconstruction. Jack Morrison had burned through his entire winter wood supply and would need to spend the rest of the season cutting more. Samuel Brooks, up on the ridge, had lost 3 fingers to frostbite when his fire went out during the worst night, and he couldn't get it restarted in time. Every conventional cabin in the camp showed signs of stress: cracked timbers from thermal contraction, gaps opened in the chinking, damage that would need repair before the next cold spell. Heinrich's dome sat unchanged, unaffected, the stones as solid as the day he'd placed them. The contrast was impossible to ignore, the difference between a design that merely survived and one that actually thrived in conditions that destroyed everything else. By spring, 3 miners had already started gathering stone for their own domed shelters. Tom Crawford was first, surprising no one who'd seen him huddled in Heinrich's dome during the freeze. He asked Heinrich to help him plan the dimensions, to explain the proportions and the technique for laying the courses so they'd curve properly. Heinrich shared everything he knew, held nothing back, seemed genuinely pleased that others would benefit from what he'd learned. Jack Morrison started his foundation in April, positioning his dome to take advantage of the hillside like Heinrich had done. Even Samuel Brooks, who'd mocked the design most loudly, admitted that he was considering stone for his next shelter, though his pride kept him from starting immediately. The technique began to spread through informal teaching, miners showing new arrivals how to select and place the stones, how to judge the curve, how thick the walls needed to be. Within 3 years, perhaps a dozen domed stone shelters dotted the high country around Silver Creek Camp, each one slightly different, but all following the same basic principles that Heinrich had proven during that terrible December. Heinrich's original dome served him for the remainder of his time in Colorado, through 7 more winters of varying severity. He refined the design over the years, added a small stone addition for storage, improved the door and the smoke vent based on experience. When he finally sold his claim in 1891 and moved down to Denver to retire, the dome passed to a younger miner named Frank Hollister, who lived in it for another 12 years. Frank raised 2 children in that space, added a wooden extension for extra room, but kept the original dome as the heart of the structure, because it remained the warmest, most efficient part of the building. The shelter finally fell into disuse around 1910, when the silver played out and the camp emptied, but the dome itself stood intact for decades after, a testament to both the durability of stone and the soundness of the design. Old maps of the area still marked its location, and hikers occasionally stumbled across the ruins, wondering about the strange circular foundation and the massive stones that had clearly been placed with intention and skill. The story of Heinrich's dome became part of the local mining lore, one of those tales that old-timers told, to illustrate the difference between stubborn tradition and practical innovation. It entered the collective knowledge of the high country, the understanding that sometimes the answer to survival wasn't burning more fuel or building bigger fires, but thinking differently about the fundamental problem. Heinrich's observation, that heat retention mattered more than heat generation, influenced building techniques throughout the region for years afterward. Even conventional log cabins started incorporating some of his principles: thicker walls, stone or earth banking, attention to minimizing heat loss rather than just maximizing heat production. The dome itself became a kind of monument to the idea that solutions could come from unexpected places, that a quarryman from Bavaria might understand mountain survival better than men who'd spent their whole lives in the Rockies. Looking back on Heinrich Bauer's story, what stands out isn't just the technical achievement of building a structure that worked, but the human courage it took to trust his own observations against the ridicule of everyone around him. He saw something that seemed obvious to him, the way stone held heat and earth protected against cold, and he had the conviction to act on that observation even when the entire camp thought he was wasting his time and risking his life. That kind of thinking, the willingness to question accepted wisdom and try something different, is what drove progress throughout the frontier era. It's what separated those who merely survived from those who found better ways to thrive. Heinrich didn't have formal education in engineering or architecture. He had eyes that observed carefully and a mind willing to trust what he saw. When convention says one thing but your experience suggests another, having the courage to follow your experience takes a strength that goes beyond physical endurance. The lesson resonates across time because the pattern repeats in every era and every field. Innovation almost always looks like foolishness at first, the new approach dismissed by those invested in the old ways. But when conditions become extreme enough, when the traditional methods fail under pressure, that's when the value of thinking differently becomes undeniable. Heinrich's dome didn't just survive that 67 below freeze, it revealed the limitations of what everyone else considered proper and proven. The miners who mocked him weren't stupid or cruel. They were simply doing what humans naturally do, trusting established methods and viewing deviation with suspicion. But frontier life had a way of teaching humility, of proving that nature didn't care about convention, only about what actually worked. Heinrich understood this in his bones, knew that the mountain would judge his design not by how traditional it was, but by whether it kept him alive. There's something deeply moving about preserving these stories, about keeping alive the memory of people like Heinrich Bauer, who solved impossible problems with the limited resources they had. These weren't engineers with teams and budgets. They were individuals facing brutal conditions with nothing but observation, determination, and ingenuity. Every time we let one of these stories fade, we lose not just historical detail, but a reminder of human capability, of what people can accomplish when they trust their own minds and refuse to accept that the current way is the only way. If you found value in Heinrich's story, if it sparked something in you about the power of practical observation and stubborn innovation, then help keep this knowledge alive by subscribing to this channel, by leaving a like to help others discover these narratives, and by sharing in the comments any stories you've heard from your own heritage about people who built, survived, or invented something that everyone else thought was impossible. These stories form a collective memory of human resilience and creativity, and they deserve to be remembered and honored. In the end, Heinrich Bauer's stone dome stands as a monument not to complexity, but to the profound power of seeing clearly and acting with conviction, even when the entire world thinks you're building nothing but a tomb for your own folly.